It's raining. I'll go around and stuff. It's raining out, so I thought I would try to do this one. And it occurred to me the other day I was actually in the car. Not centered up here, am I? Out of that. Was in the car and USB thumb drive with 3,000 songs on it was randomly picking songs. And up came Horse with No Name. You probably never heard of this song, but I've been to the desert on a horse with no name. Blah, 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 blah. Anyway, it occurred to me, I've been to the desert, and it was a reflection of like, why? How did I end up being in the desert several times? And why did I have to do that? It's like, I mean, some people have probably never been to the desert, and I don't think they missed anything. But anyway, I've had a period of time in the desert. And again, this, what is it? Karma comes to mind. What is it about the desert? Is something out of my karma? I don't know. What did I, and I reflect on it, and what did I get out of it, if anything? And yeah, I did. First time desert was in the U.S. Army and Air Defense Artillery, an officer. And when I finally did join the Army, I'd taken a year off from school, already been commissioned. The Army School for Army Air Defense was in El Paso, Texas. And that's where I went. And we were forming up a new unit to take a missile system to South Korea. And everybody that was in that unit was new to the unit, didn't exist before. And outside, I lived in El Paso on the Army base, but we had a range camp. That's what it was called. And it was like, I don't know, 30, 40 miles maybe north. I'm not sure if it was northeast or northwest of El Paso, but it was out in the desert. And if you kept going north and to east or west, you could get to Alamogordo. Now, I never did go to Alamogordo. Nuclear bombs, all that stuff. But the Army had a huge reservation, I guess it's called. I don't know what they... We had a place out there with buildings, and all of the troops, all the enlisted men in the unit, they all lived out there. And each day I was living in El Paso, either in the BOQ, Bachelor Officers Quarters, and then later in a home when my wife joined me. And we would drive out, and I think we had to be there like at 7 a.m. in the morning, so we had to leave at 6 a.m. or something like that. Drive out through the desert, scrub brush, no trees. It was just scrub brush and sand and some cattle here and there. And they had cattle guards on the roads. It was open range. And anyway, that was my first exposure to the desert. And I didn't stay out there much. I was out during the day a lot, but we did have field exercises where we took our tracked vehicles and missiles. I had 4 tracked missile units assigned to me, and I commanded, I was 35, 40 men, something like that, in that unit. And so we did have exercises where we would fire up these tracked things and drive around in the desert. And one of the things I quickly learned was that I was one of the few people that could read a map. the sergeant I had, who'd been in the Army for like 18, 19 years, he couldn't read a map to save his ass. And I had a radio in my Jeep, and I could talk to the tracked missile launchers. And they were supposed to take up positions on hills and so on that I had found that would provide a good operating position. And so my experience at the desert in El Paso was mainly what I really remember was the night maneuvers and riding around the desert in the dark and you not having a clue where you are. There were some, if you want to call them roads, but they didn't have any markings of any kind or anything like that. And I had three of the four units that I had got lost. They didn't know where they were. We didn't have any GPS at the time or anything like that. They got lost, and so I had to track them down and on the radio with them. Anyway, the other issue was I did spend the night, I think, out there once, and it was cold at night in the desert. As hot as could get during the day, which I think everything shut down like 3 o'clock, past 3 or 4 o'clock. The Army shut down. It just got too hot. And that was the normal day. It was 7 a.m. The desert was early start and early done because of the heat. And one of the things I do remember about El Paso was every day you woke up and there was blazing sun. I mean, rarely was a cloud in the sky, and I don't remember it ever raining. If it did, I don't remember it. One cloudy day, maybe, out of almost a year that I spent there. So it was blue sky. You woke up in the morning, bang, smash. I actually got to wanting, a cloudy day to break up the monotony of the sun every day, every day, every day. And it was cold at night. And the desert turned out to be, I hadn't thought about it before. They talk about the ocean that once upon a time, cities and other things, they just took their garbage out in the ocean and dumped it overboard and it disappeared. It was a perfect hiding place for anything, including garbage. Just dump it overboard and it went to the bottom and you never saw it again. Well, mostly. Well, the desert was also like that. We had an occasion where all of the track vehicles that I had, and the whole unit had, there were others, ran on diesel fuel. And we would have a tanker, a regular gasoline type tanker you see around wherever you live, deliver us fuel. And I think it was, I can't remember if it was pumped, if we had storage units. I don't know, except they brought out a tanker and we started filling up our tracks, and didn't take very long to figure out that it wasn't diesel, it was gasoline, and you don't put gasoline in a diesel engine. So we had this whole, I don't know how many gallons a tanker was, but there was this deal with the Army, like on ammunition, missiles, whatever it was. If you checked it out and took it out to the range, you couldn't bring it back. You had to use it. It wasn't, the accounting didn't allow for returns in the Army. So, I wasn't in charge, but somebody took this gas tanker full of gasoline, pulled off of the road out in the desert and opened up the valves and let whatever it was, thousands of gallons of gasoline just sink into the sand, and it was like the ocean disappeared. I think that's a problem they've had on a lot of Army bases over the years, that there have been instances like that, and no telling what the sand's out there at the range camp. I think it was, I want to say Belladonna, but that's not right. I can't remember the name of the range camp, but it's probably still there for troop training. Anyway, the desert, since I was married and came home every night, I didn't spend a lot of time in the desert. I had friends who were lieutenants, and they bought like motocross bikes, and they drove out through the desert, and often had tire repairs to do because a lot of stuff in the desert is pointy, spiky, you know. Cactus, of course. Did see a tarantula in the desert one day at the range. We had, they flew these really old gasoline powered, no, I guess they were jets, drones around, and we could practice aiming at them and shooting at them. And because they dragged a hot spot, and the missiles we used targeted heat. They were not very sophisticated missiles. And we did, in fact, one day wound up hitting one of the drones, by accident, if you want to call it that. I had worked I had been trained on the missile system, and I had then trained all the people that I had my particular 4 track vehicles and all the support personnel for it. I had trained them on how to use the weapon system, and there were 4 missiles on a turret that you could rotate around, and you had to get a visual target, visual reticle on a hotspot, and then it would say lock or something, and you'd pull the trigger, and the missile would launch and supposedly hit that hotspot. Anyway, we wound up downing one of the drones one time, and I'm sure that drone is still laying in the desert wherever it came down. Didn't see a lot of animals at tarantulas. Didn't, jackrabbits in the evening, the desert. But I didn't have a lot of experience with the desert, but I was, in the Army. They sent me to the desert. What was the deal with the desert, I mean, scrub bush, no trees, not green. From there I made it into Mexico a couple times, but desert. I did make a run from El Paso over to Dallas one time, and it's interesting. The desert changes. That was like 300-400 miles, and I went across Route 10, and the desert is not the same everywhere. It's monotonous in a way, but it does change. The rocks change, the vegetation changes, the topology of the land changes. It can be flat, for sure, but it can have ridges and plateaus and high mesas and low mesas, all kind of interesting things related to it. Okay, switch forward probably 4, 5, 6 years later. I'm working for a government contractor. He gets a contract for the Army's electronic warfare testing ground, which is in Fort Huachuca, Arizona, which is about 30, 40 miles south of Tucson. So I get sent to Fort Huachuca, and I went there a couple times, and I could be there for, I think maybe the longest stay was a month and a half, 2 months, something like that. Now there was desert again. Only this time, since I lived there, if you will, for a while was in a motel, and another time a friend and I rented a trailer. We had sort of a living quarters, and I don't know how long, I can't remember exactly how long I was there, but I was there for a while. So on weekends I got to roam around, and there was a whole lot of nothing around there. One of the things that there was Coronado National Monument, I think it's called, and it was located in the Huachuca Mountains down farther south from Fort Huachuca. And this was a pretty good mountain. You could drive up close to the top of it, and then you could hike up to the very peak of the thing and look out onto, I don't know, I need to look it up, but you can look out on like 1,000,000 acres of desert. It faced the west because the sun set down over there, and if you sat up on top, you could just, it was quiet, empty, nothing. It's an amazing sort of sight. I guess the closest thing I could think of is if you're an astronaut or something, you get way high up and you can see a whole lot of stuff. Well, here up on top of the Coronado National Monument, you could see to the west. There was no buildings, no roads, no anything. It just stretched on and on and on, maybe like you can in Africa or something. But this was, scrub brush. It didn't, this particular area didn't have saguaro cactuses. I did run into those and went to Saguaro National Monument. I saw cactuses of all time, prickly pears, and wound up having prickly pear soup. And the desert had all kind of attributes to it. It was in I was up on Coronado National Monument. Coronado was a Spanish conquistador, I think it was. He came over, I think he came into Mexico first, but he was on an expedition to find the fabled 7 cities of gold. And he and his troops marched all over out there in Mexico and went up into Arizona, which is on the Mexican border, and came across the Huachuca Mountains at Coronado National Monument. Now, why it was there was he had come through that area and got a real good view of what laid ahead of him, which was a big fat nothing, except more of what he'd been. And you look out 1,000,000 acres, I didn't even see any water. There were no ponds, no rivers, nothing like that. Now, the desert can have streams and rivers. If a flash flood, if it rained really hard, any little gully could become a flood. Up in Tucson, it was interesting. Again, it's just desert all around Tucson. But you were warned of various roads that the coming up would be a dip, and if there was a rainstorm, you didn't want to drive through that dip because it could be a flood. So it was an interesting aspect. You don't think of water in the desert, but when I was out roaming around in the desert, I came on a lot of dried up creek beds. They probably weren't a lot dried up when the rain came through, but nonetheless, there was all kind of stuff out there. My main thing with animals was ravens, and ravens are cool, really smart birds. And the other aspect of desert, and what did I get desert for? I think it was before, but I might be after. I don't remember. I started reading a series of books called Don Juan and the Yaqui Way of Knowledge. And the Yaqui is an indigenous Indian tribe in northern Mexico or central Mexico. And the Don Juan was a shaman who lived in the desert and knew the desert. And peyote was part of practicing what he did. And so I was reading at the same time. And I would go out in the desert and just drive off of someplace or another, and I'd get out on foot. And for a while, a whole other story, I'd be looking around for peyote to see if I could find it in the wild. And I had general descriptions where it might be found, and that's how I sort of got into the topology of the desert. There were high mesas that set up, and different plant life there, and then there were places like Coronado National Monument. As you got up high enough, you got into the big pine trees that you find in western states, and they had those up there. There was actually a forest up there if you got up high enough. And the high desert, which is like 6,000–7,000 feet in altitude, like in Flagstaff, that's up above the high desert. Desert changes, low desert, high desert. What is that called? Death Valley, that's a low desert. Well, That whole area is raised up higher than the East Coast, but it's a low spot in the desert, and it's hot as terrible. I've never been to Death Valley. Never been through it. I don't have any interest. I did. There were towns in the desert besides Tucson. Tombstone. Everybody's heard of Tombstone. The shootout that occurred at the Tombstone. Cowboys and Indians, and cowboys and bad guys. And I was also at Bisbee. There were also a lot of silver mines out in the desert. There were minerals there. And in fact, coming out of Tucson and going down Huachuca, you went past the Anaconda copper mill. Huge structure processing copper. And so there were a lot of minerals in the desert. There were gold miners that had been in the area. Mainly it was silver. There were a lot of silver mines. I visited several, and they had massive sort of infrastructure there for a while, and then it was basically a ghost town. The silver had dried up, everybody left, and there was holes in the ground and machinery, and but anyway, it was a whole lot to the desert, Here I am wandering around. Oh, I'm also in the dark in the desert. Up on Coronado National Monument, I learned my lesson. You stay up there and you watch the sun go down, then you get sunblind, and you can't see in the dark, and now you got to fumble and stumble your way down off of this rather steep path that you had to climb to get up to the very tippy top. So I learned my lesson. Don't stare into the sun in a place like that. It's not good. But anyway, wandering around and looking for beauty and feeling the vibe of the place. When you're out in the desert by yourself, it's interesting your essence. You get on an elevator and you're in a space. You got a space around you, Don't get into my space, man, that kind of stuff. When you're in the desert and you're out there by yourself and you can just listen to the wind or the sand, you realize your presence gets very large. It expands a lot. And I always thought that I could probably tell if there was anything living. A rabbit, I don't know, coyote. There were coyotes in the desert, saw those. But the ravens were the real thing because they were smart. And according to Don Juan, they knew things and they could teach you things. And if you're really good at being a shaman, you could even change yourself into a raven. Now, I didn't learn that trick. But anyway, I would go out, get out of the car, and it didn't take very long before a raven would show up and fly off and land on some scrub bush tree and turn around and call at me and call at me. And so, okay, I would walk toward him. And I'd get maybe, I don't know, 25 yards away or something, and he'd call and call, and then he would get up and he'd fly another 50, 100 yards away, and he would stop and get on the, and he would call me again. And so I followed you, following the ravens, and I don't know what I expected he was going to lead me to, and I did this for a while. I don't know how long it was, but anyway, the last call, it struck me, I had no idea where I was. I had just been following the raven, wherever the raven flew. That's what I did. I followed the raven and looked around, and the terrain there was not flat. It was all lumpy, and you couldn't see. I was down sort of in a gully of some kind, and you couldn't see over the top. So I couldn't see the car, I couldn't see a road, I couldn't see anything except where I was. And so I was like, this is not a good thing. In fact, I was thinking about it. I don't even know what I did for water. I must have taken it with me, but I don't remember running the canteen. I do remember one time I was on this dirt road, all dirt roads, out through there. There's actually many dirt roads. And sometimes they have a sign saying Mexican border on the left, right over there. You could get out of the car and walk 5 feet and you could be in Mexico. And there was really nothing there. Took a road from Bisbee. Bisbee was an old copper mining town. Had been great in the early 1900s when electrification started in the United States. They needed copper, and so Bisbee had a big copper vein there, and town was rich. It had a fine old hotel there, supposedly John Wayne owned or did at one time. And he'd been there. He had been there many times. There were photographs of him sitting on the front porch and so on. But anyway, yeah, I spent some time in Bisbee. But there was an old dirt road that went from Bisbee over to Nogales, Mexico, and it ran along the U.S. Mexican border in Arizona. And one day, there's a big sign: don't go there. Especially don't go there in a regular car, and don't go there if you don't have tire change, and just don't go there. Well, I did go there, and it was an interesting, I think it was 60, 70, 80 miles from Bisbee to Nogales across the southern border with Mexico, and surprisingly there were some ranches, big old style ranch houses out there. I did see some cattle. They were the longhorn type because one cow needed 25 acres of that scrub brush to keep himself fed. There weren't very many. It wasn't herds and giant herds of cattle like you'll see in the east here in Shenandoah Valley or where it's green. But anyway, rode across the Nogales and empty. Saw some deer, bighorn sheep, not bighorn, antelope, whatever they call it. You could see those off in the distance. But it was a long, dusty road, and I think it had a convertible, and desert. To the left of me was Mexico. To the right of me was the U.S. of A. And it was rolling. You could not see hundreds of miles like up on top of Coronado, but blue sky everywhere and the sun beating down on you. That was a constant. The desert and the sun. Sun beat down on you, and I saw a movie once about Flight of Phoenix where a plane crashes in the Sahara Desert, and that was deserts. I don't know. When I was in the desert, I did think about things, experience things. Like I say, one of the things that I became aware of was how my space expanded a lot. I don't know what I mean by that. My beingness. The desert knew I was there, and I don't know how. Football field, I don't know how far out it stretched, but a long ways. And all I was doing was listening, hearing the winds. Wind is definitely different in the desert. Wind is also different out on the prairie where there's just grasses. And you can hear the wind blow across the grasses, the prairie. That's an interesting hearing. I got read that that happens, but until you hear it yourself. Same way in the desert when you hear the breeze come up out of nowhere and swish about. It usually light. I don't remember any heavy winds. Wild boar up at Coronado National Forest, maybe park monument. He said there were big pine trees up there, like they have up at Flagstaff, up in the high deserts, and they had wild boar up there. I saw them, wild pigs, if you want to call them. They run across the road. I think people hunted them out there. There was big mule deer uh, in various parts of the Machuca Mountains. So animal life of all kinds. I went up to, I don't know, it wasn't Tucson, it was someplace like that. And there was a museum there, desert museum. And stumble around in the desert museum and seeing, the cactus and about the flora and the indigenous peoples and all. And I'd had a dream years before, and in this dream, I had met a Zuni, Zuni. And I remember whoever was the Zuni spelled it for me because I had no Zuni. I don't know. There's no Zunis. I know Cherokees and Sioux and Chippewa and Apache, but I never heard of Zuni. Zuni Indian. Anyway, here I'm at this museum out in wherever it was in Arizona. Come across this whole big section on Zuni Indians. Big tribe there. I don't think Don Juan was Zuni. He was something else, but it was Zuni. And it rang a bell. I was like, man, maybe the reason I'm in the desert was I was a Zuni at one time. That's possible, right? I mean, yeah, I don't know. So, there's a long, twisting tales to this whole story. Lived, 15 years later, I'm living someplace and I go into this art gallery I've never been in before. And there on the wall is a painting of a Zuni governor. That's the label in it's watercolors. That's the label in the watercolor. This is the Zuni governor. So I go, man, I got to have that. And the guy wanted a lot of money for it. And I said, would you trade me? He said, what do you got? And I said, okay, well, I got a Triumph motorcycle in a box. I lent money to one of my friends. He never could pay me back, but he had taken apart his Triumph motorcycle. He'd given it to me, and it was in a box. He swears all the parts are there. So I traded a a Triumph motorcycle in a box for a watercolor of a Zuni governor. So I have that, and it's always around. And I like to think of myself as a Zuni governor. And in fact, I ran into an Apache lady that cuts my hair, and so she knows me as the Zuni. We try to link on the indigenous tribe thing. She's a little skeptical about it, but I mean, you're probably skeptical about it. I'm skeptical about it, but the desert. The whole point of this whole thing is, why the desert? Now, you must have had something or others, like, if you have something to think about it, like, how did I wind up here? You know? Why did this happen? I wouldn't have picked Arizona as a place, to go live or anything. I actually thought about it one time afterwards up in Flagstaff. It's a little too cold up there, but I do like the area. It's up it's up in high desert above, and people in the desert, it's got trees. Anyway, I don't know the whole Don Juan thing and the magic of the shaman, and I went to Kitt Peak Observatory, which is in Arizona. It's north of Tucson, and I did go up there one weekend. I went a lot of places on weekends, roamed around. Went to Kitt Peak, and I may have sold the story already, maybe not. Got up on top. There was nobody there. I thought for sure there would be a gate. I'd have to go to a gate guard. No, I just drove in and parked. It was a visitor parking. I'm sure it was visitor parking. I just parked. Got out, started looking around for somebody. Couldn't find anybody. Roamed in and out of all the buildings. Went up to the big, they had a optical telescope in one of the buildings. Got up, sat underneath of it in a little chair and looked up at the little eyepiece on this 400 to 1,000 million pound telescope. Felt fear right away because the whole thing was going to fall on my eye. Roamed around, went over to the Sun Observatory, which was a very deep shaft under the sand, limestone, whatever the bedrock was, and kept the air at a constant temperature so that the images would not be rippled by air currents. And run around, come down off of Kitt Peak, never see a person. I'm up there, I could have while I'm walking through offices with drawers open. I mean, it was the strangest thing. And I ran into somebody recently that worked there, and I said, "How?" He said, "Well, maybe they're on lunch break." No, there was nobody there, lunch break or not. I must have been there for a couple hours and nobody. I come down off of Kit Peak, which is a really steep drive, by the way, up. I come down off of Kit Peak. I'm 50, 60 miles outside of Tucson to the north. There's only really one road that goes that direction. So I'm driving along the road, and up ahead I see this old Indian with his thumb out. And he is older, and I know he's an indigenous Indian. He's not Hispanic, no. He's an American Indian of some type. And he's got his thumb out, and I have to confess, I couldn't pick him up. I was too afraid. I thought maybe it was Don Juan from the books I've been reading. And if I pick him up, he could talk me into becoming a raven and go into Mexico and be a student, and I'd never go home. I just couldn't do it. I was scared. The whole thing freaked me out. Kit Peak being empty, the whole desert thing. There's nobody there. You're by yourself. It's essence of other life is, especially human type life, is rare. It must have been weird back in the old days when you rode horses and you could ride for days and days and days and days and days and days and you never saw any other person. And then when you did run into somebody, what would reaction you have? I mean, you'd be a little fearful, I mean, the guy might want your stuff, or you're so happy to see somebody you want to talk to them about everything. Hey man, I never saw any bear, but I whole desert thing is a giant orb of all kind of stuff. And why did I have to do the desert? I went back years later and took the wife, and we toured, went to Tucson and up to Flagstaff and all around Tombstone, Bisbee, across the Nogales. I recreated it all. It was a place that I have gone more than once, and that should tell you something. There is an affinity to it. It is big sky country. The emptiness of it has an appeal to me. I prefer it over Manhattan. I just I Between Manhattan and Tombstone, Arizona, I take Tombstone any day of the week. Manhattan is great. I enjoy while I'm being there, but it's too much for middle feeble me. Whereas in Tombstone, when I went to Tombstone, and there was a saloon there, and I'm sitting there having a beer, and in walks like, I don't know how many people came in, but they were all carrying Winchester repeating rifles, and walked in and went up to the bar and put their rifle up on the bar and ordered a drink, and nobody even paid any mind. It was like, it's been going on since the play, in the 1800s or something. I don't know. It was like normal. Nobody even blinked an eye. It's just the way it is. It's a different world, and okay, I like it here. Yeah, all kind of aspects. I don't even know. Busted a car oil pan following dirt windy trails going back into silver mines. Coming down out of there, I'd be real careful, but there was, a big rock, gnarly rock sticking out of the middle of the road, and the car only set this high off the road, and I snagged it and punctured a hole in the oil pan, and so I did manage to get down off. That would have been real bad, but I had to put leaded fuel in an unleaded car. They didn't. It was in the transition period in the 70s, and some gas stations didn't have unleaded fuel, even though the rental car that I punctured a hole in the oil pan, they wanted unleaded fuel, but I didn't have any choice. Out of gas, only gas available. Saguaro National Monument with saguaro cactuses were cool. There were other little places on the Mexican border that you could go to. I think one was near Saguaro National Monument. I can't remember the name of the little town, but you could see it off in the distance, and you could drive down to it, and it was just like a sign saying Mexico. And right over there was this little town. I mean, nothing on the American side, but right over there was this little Mexican town. And I didn't go in. I had no need to. But I was like, what? What are they doing over there? There was not anything around. I didn't understand. Um, Desert birds, ravens. That was the real thing for me, was ravens. And they were always around. If you go to Grand Canyon, you go anywhere out west, you run into ravens. And just remember, they're smart, and they can mislead you. They lie. They tell you, follow me and I'll take you to the 7 cities of gold, but that isn't true. Anyway, the whole thing about desert. For some reason, I have a dose of desert. Just like I have a dose when I was a kid. All my father, my grandfather, and all my uncles were hunters. Hunted rabbit, squirrel, deer. I have a hunting background, guns. That's all. I don't know why. That's what I got. It's what people get different stuff. I got that. For some reason, I got the desert too. I got the experience, and I'm sure there's 100 tons that I didn't even get to mine properly, MIND properly. But I went to Egypt, and that's another deserty sort of area, but it's not like the desert in Arizona and New Mexico and in Texas, those areas that have. I've spent time in Texas more than umpteen times. For some reason, drawn to that Las Vegas desert. You know, drove across whatever. Drove through the dawn. Drove through the night to get to Las Vegas, and it was as dark as anything at nighttime out in the middle of nowhere in the desert. No lights at all. And then way off in the distance, there's this light. Las Vegas. It's only 80 miles away, but you're already seeing the light dimly on the horizon. Coming into Vegas at 2 in the morning, out of the desert on some little road, I don't know. But lights, in the desert. One time in Fort Huachuca, there was a group of women who had these four wheelers or whatever, and they would tear around the desert at night, and you could see the lights on their four wheelers. Supposedly they were drinking cheap wine and driving around, and they also smoked mesquite, or I don't know, there was wacky weed. I can't think of Jimson weed. That's what it was. They would make something out of Jimson weed and drink it or smoke it or whatever, and they'd ride around the desert, in a crazy fashion. But I liked everybody I met in Arizona. I'm sorry I couldn't pick up Don Juan, or this indigenous Indian who had his thumb out, who was 50 miles from any kind of civilization at all. I have no idea how he got there. Yeah, I'm not even sure he was there. Maybe I dreamed the whole thing. You get old, you get confused. What's dream and what's reality? But I know I was in Arizona. I don't know what other than the Zinni governor, which I brought in Virginia. I'm not sure what else I have from the Arizona days. Some pictures, but not many. Anyway, point being is I really don't know why I needed it, but it must be some deep karmic thing. Sometime, somewhere in my past, I had to have been, you know, raised in the lion's den or some such nonsense. I know I've been a shepherd boy guarding the sheep in country like Israel or somewhere in that sort of deserty setting. Like I said, I went to Egypt. I had to go to the antiquity of the place, and there's a lot of sand and scrubby stuff there. Anyway, I have no idea, but if you ever get, I don't know what you're drawn to. Maybe you're drawn to lakes or skiing, you know, whatever you grow up with. So this one was Uncle Ron's stuff, and just a yammer bammer, a long one about desert and why I have desert in my experience set. I experienced it, some of it anyway, and I've shared some of it. And today is the 20th of June, 2023. Uncle Ron stuff, that's it for now. Boop.